Hey, everybody, welcome to this week's episode of the Integrated Man Project podcast. Before we jump into this week's episode, I did want to share about an exclusive membership I'm going to be launching to help shape the Integrated Man Project community. If this is something you'd be interested in, where you will be co-laboring with me, sharing your ideas, giving input, giving me feedback, part of kind of this process of creating something bigger and better for all men, I would love for you to join. And if this is something you're interested, please reach out to me. Email me at integratedmanproject@gmail.com. You could also send me a direct message on Instagram as well, or on LinkedIn. I would love for you to reach out to me. I would love for you to be part of this exclusive group to help, again, shape and form this Integrated Man community. Because as you do this, as we share in this journey together, we're going to create a community of men around the world where we become more grounded, more adaptable, more resilient, and more authentic men. So come on and join. If you're interested in this, please reach out to me. And without further ado, let's get into this week's episode. Hey, everybody. Welcome to this week's episode of the Integrated Man Project podcast. Sometimes I feel like that's just like if I say it too fast, I'm going to slur that and sound ridiculous. But anyway, welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Whenever you're listening to this, if you're watching us, that's even better because you get to see, I don't know, us. And I like that. I can't see you. I can see Tyler. And I'm going to welcome Tyler to this show. Hey, how's it going, man?
Hey,
Welcome.
glad to be here for the early bird edition of the Integrated Man Project.
Thank you. I figure, if anyone could do it, Tyler can. I'll make a shirt for you. Yeah, early bird edition. Those that don't know, I'm out in California. I'm doing pre, my whole family waking up. It's about, 5:30 a.m., 5:30 my time. Those military dudes and women listening. And Tyler, I think, is not as early as I am.
No, not as early.
but
Early enough.
Hey, early enough. So welcome, Tyler. Hey, can you do a quick intro of who you are, kind of what you're doing right now in your life, and tell us about yourself?
Yeah, so my name is Tyler. I grew up on a small family farm in North Dakota, extremely rural, even by North Dakota standards, and didn't grow up with much. Things got better as I got a little bit older, but kind of a economically lean community. So I wanted an opportunity to, like a lot of other people, go see the world a little bit, do something outside of the bubble that I've been in. So I joined the Army, and I was in the Army, I think, 5 days after I graduated from high school. And between active duty and deployments and National Guard and Reserve, I ended up making a full career out of it. So I retired just shy of 21 years right before the pandemic. So about half of that career, I was more part-time basis. I wasn't occupying all of my time. So then I jumped into paramilitary work and did some embedded work overseas with the Afghan army as a civilian, but working for the United States government indirectly. Did some other paramilitary contracts and training support, and then eventually got into the corporate security business and worked for a couple of large global firms and specialized in consulting work for Fortune 500 clients. So high revenue accounts, and eventually worked as a PMO. So a project manager of project managers for the entire company. Went into a managing director role, was here in Minneapolis during the civil unrest and riots. And I had a team of around 1,100 security people that worked for me at the time. So a pretty large team, and kind of managing all of that. And then eventually I decided to step back from the corporate ladder and take a shot on myself. So opened up my own consultancy last year and really started marketing it outright about 4 months ago. And so I'm very much an early startup phase right now, doing a lot of the same sort of consulting and coaching and executive advisory work that I've been doing over the last 15, 20 years. But now I'm doing it for myself and sending out the invoices and collecting the money on top of it. But with that comes a little bit more creative control and flexibility, and taking on the projects that I want to take on, and working with clients that I want to work with. So we're going to give it our best shot and see where this thing goes.
Yeah, that's exciting. I think when we talked first, you were talking about that and stepping on your own while exciting and creative. You get the creative
Hmm.
power and get to choose who you want to work with, which is obviously you get to pick the people.
Right.
Um, but also there's always the other stuff that goes along with your own business and all that kind of thing. All the maybe other stressors of dealing with,
Right.
hey, I'm figuring this stuff out and scaling and
Hmm.
all those things of all those solopreneurs, or I'm not sure if that's the language you would use for yourself. So a solopreneur, is that what you would call yourself?
Yeah, I think that seems to be kind of the trend now, and I'm not sure. Maybe the distinction on that came from the overusage of an entrepreneur. I was talking with someone the other day, and they were joking about it. It's like we were having a joke about, well, who's an entrepreneur versus, it's like, dude, who's unemployed with an idea? If you have an idea and you're unemployed, that doesn't necessarily make you an entrepreneur if you're not really actioning or executing anything. So it's like
True.
that's the distinction. So I think that
Yeah.
some people took to the solopreneur because apparently now entrepreneurship is a big enough part of our society now, I guess, again, since we went from being entrepreneurs to where we were businesses and corporations for 50 or 60 years, to where people are now opening up their own blacksmith shop at the corner and banging out their own horseshoes again. So we've kind of seen that full evolution to where
Yeah.
we're coming back to where there's a lot more individual operators. So I think that they must need to make a distinction between an entrepreneur and a solopreneur. Just, well, you don't actually have a team and it's just you. So I'm a real entrepreneur because I have 10 employees. And so now I have the employee dynamic on top of all the other back end and keeping your
Yeah.
books right and bills
Yeah.
out and
Yeah. Yeah.
collecting money
Yeah.
and whatever.
That's funny. Yeah. I say it like tongue in cheek, but like I know maybe it's just a rebrand. It's a refresh 2.0 of the language being used. I think I've heard another one called a YouTubepreneur or something like that. That's like for a YouTuber. Yeah. Like a professional
Well,
YouTuber is a
I think that
YouTubepreneur.
it seems like the preneur is being attached to a lot more things now.
Yes, it is. I think
I
so.
coming from the military world, and I've got friends who are industrious and doing a lot of different things for like veterans who are transitioning and like business networks. And so I've heard in my little corner of the world the term veterpreneur being highlighted a bit more. So where it used to be
Veteranpreneur.
just you're a small veteran owned business is what it used to be. Now you're a veterpreneur. So
Okay, okay, yeah. I think yeah. I mean, I guess language of the day, right? I think it's the evolution of language too. It's like,
right.
yeah, it's when how you describe yourself, and I guess capitalizing on those things. So I'm glad you're on, by the way, Tyler, because what I want, with your background, part of, and for whatever reason, I'm getting all these doors. Well, part of it, you opened the door for me too, and if having, meeting more with first responders, having more
Hmm.
conversations with, usually ex special forces, ex military operatives. Usually they're not active at the time, and having these conversations. And I'm thinking a buddy of mine, John McCaskill, who I think was
Hmm.
one of the first guys I was able to meet with, at least have a conversation with on the podcast, and talk about his experience coming out and dealing with mental wellness and recovery. And that really piqued my interest. Those that don't know, I grew up in a military family. My dad was in the Navy. I almost joined the military, almost went to the academy when I was younger. I actually wanted to be a Navy SEAL, or either that, or I wanted to fly an F-14. Although, because of Top Gun, that was
Right. Of
like my
course.
vision as a kid. And then by the time I got old enough, F-14s were being phased out, and it was, F-18s, I think, right? F-18s,
Well,
the
and wasn't it
Hornets.
the F-14 that in the latest or the reboot of the
Yeah,
Top Gun movie, it is the F-14 was kind of the butt of jokes, and then it was
yes,
the hero's journey of where it became
yeah.
kind of one of the
It
character
was really,
heroes of the
it
entire
really was
story.
rad. Yeah, that was actually a really rad scene. Yeah, it was super rad. It was, yeah, great movie, by the way. As far
Yeah,
as a second,
surprisingly good. When I heard about the sequel to begin with, I'm like, oh, brother, here we go.
I
And then
know.
even after it came out, it's like I resisted for a long time just because it's like, it's going to be a sequel. Tom Cruise
Yeah,
is older now and it's not going to be as good. And then my wife and I were flying somewhere. And so we were on a plane that happened to have the screens and stuff. And I said, it's like, wow, I've got the time. I'm going to go ahead and watch. I'm like, wow, this is really good.
yeah. And it was, and if it was that good on a tiny screen, imagine it, how good it
Right.
would be on because it was real. The sound was amazing. I was like, dang, they really did a good job. So that's what I wanted to be growing up,
Right.
and ended up not going that route. Clearly, I ended up becoming a therapist. There you go. And now mind body coach. So, but I have a huge respect for the men and women that serve, and again, being around that as a kid, and going to military events and air bases. And my dad, he did P3s and submarine hunters back in the day, and in the 80s and 90s. I think now they're at this point all pretty much decommissioned now, P3s. Anyway,
Well, that was a
off
sign of the
topic.
times for sure, though. That's peak Cold War and
Yeah, yeah.
submarine
Yeah,
hunting and all of that stuff and
yeah.
counter surveillance. So
Yeah,
yeah,
he shared his stories with me, yeah, in Alaska, and they'd go hunting and falling around and getting intel, and so I remember hearing the stories as a kid, and he'd tell me
we
about
were
them.
under 100 feet of ice and we were listening and no one knew we were there, right?
Yeah, it's it's that was the times, right? And so,
Hmm.
I hear it growing up. It's always had like a part of me was always like I was always been intrigued and kind of drawn to that to a degree, but I just chose a different path. But kind of talking and now in the field I do work in with kind of trauma recovery and wellness and trying to help people get back and be more holistically healthy with their families, with themselves, with their friends, with their businesses. How do we help these men and women? And again, talking with John and hearing his story, and now meeting with you and a bunch of other now guys that I'm now getting connected with.
Hmm.
It's intriguing and trying to work on asking these questions of, hey, now at this stage of your life, or even coming out of the military,
Hmm.
what does it look like for you being integrated? And what I mean by that is being kind of balanced and healthy psychologically, physically, socially, spiritually. How do we recover, and what are those things you're doing? And so kind of when I heard John's story, like one of his big tenets was, and this is, you could see his platform is huge on this now, which is really, really amazing, is really trying to bring mindfulness, the practice of
Hmm.
more specifically breath work, because mindfulness as a concept, I think you could apply to everyday life, just being a mindful life. Like
Right.
we're mindful. I'm in mindfulness right now with you because I'm very present with you, right?
Hmm.
So, but he's really taking mindfulness breath work to, I think, a whole level, especially with military, like saying, hey guys, this is huge, and this has really helped my recovery from PTSD and other things. And so that's something he's kind of incorporating and trying to integrate into
Yeah.
all that he's doing. And so I'm wondering, as you think of your life right now being integrated in all those areas, like what comes up for you? What has been your journey? And what are you doing? I guess what has that journey looked like for you, and kind of, where are you at now with that? And kind of what are you engaging in now to kind of be balanced and holistically healthy?
It's funny that you brought up the breath work piece of it, and you're right. John has begun to establish himself as a real leading voice for the veteran community
Hmm.
around, being open about, things that people might have going on in their life to kind of remove some of the stigma. So I think that any of the discussions or conversations that, thoughtful, qualified people can have that are in the public domain, I think it kind of helps normalize some of it a bit. So you might have that person that's not ready to be, maybe like coming from the military, not being a public voice, because most of us, for the majority of our careers, were not public voices. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. But,
Hmm.
and yeah, so I'm actually meeting with someone else today, and we're going to have a discussion on a podcast. And I don't know if we'll talk about it, but he's really big into breath work as well. And we'll talk some more about that after the episode. But I'm like, oh, what a coincidence. But so I think that that's kind of bringing this back to being an integrated man. I think that's where that comes into the conversation, though, is that we're starting to see some methodologies and modalities that are being talked about and being practiced more. And it's not just one outlier that got out of the military off doing
Hmm.
some woo woo stuff. It's more, we're having normalized discussions about this. And I think the thing with the military is most of us were in a very programmed organization for a long time, and I don't mean it in a negative way. It's just, it's a place where we're so mission focused that
Hmm.
you didn't have a lot of time or thought to put into all of these other things that go on. So I
Yeah.
think that that's why you don't really hear from active military folks so much. It's just
Mm.
kind of by design. But then
Yeah.
as soon as you have folks start retiring, that's when they start taking a look at what else is out in the world outside of this,
Right.
very unique, you know, societal subculture that, we were just kind of insulated from a lot of other things and we were off doing our own stuff. And then you get out and it's like, okay, well, hello, big world. Now I need to start understanding you. So if you're someone that's struggling or suffering, it's like there are things now to kind of see, what's out there, or conversations like this as well. Whereas I think about when, I got off active duty in 2002 and then into the National Guard and kind of split time between doing military related activities as an employee and then also splitting time with the military. So I would say that compared to some who did a full 20 years plus active duty and then retired, I had the benefit of a little bit more of a phased, softer landing than some of them. And even then,
Mm.
military transition can be hard, from the things that you'd experienced in operations, and then also basically having to make a complete culture and mindset change to new things and figuring out the world and even the way that people speak and interact and what those differences are. So it's good to see things like this that are happening now to where more people are having open conversations, because that's then truly how we become integrated, whether it's, through use of traditional therapies, non-traditional medicines, traditional treatments, then also things like breath work. And then in some cases, it's even just seeing figures out in the public who have reputable experience having real conversations about this stuff. It starts to normalize it. So even for some people who aren't maybe ready to take the step into how do I become holistic, they're starting to hear the conversations about it. And then they can decide for themselves, what works for me, versus what works for someone else. Right.
Yeah. How you put it, right? The military and like anything can have its own subculture and kind of
Mhm.
mission focus and kind of program. And not that it's necessarily, it's not going to, like you said, we're not going to moralize it as being good, bad, right, wrong. It's more of, hey,
Mhm.
this is just the culture that what we lived in. And there's some things within this culture that are great and some things that are like, hey, maybe not so effective, right?
Right.
And then especially as we retire or if we're dealing with military or maybe kind of elite military, right? When they come out, what are they dealing with and how do they, what's been the, what has been the program, or for lack of a better word, to have holistic health? And, what does it look like within? And is it effective? And or are they missing? Are there pieces and components missing? And, you know, because then we come out, like you said, it's like, oh, hello, new world. And, oh, there's other things. And there's things I haven't thought about it. Maybe I haven't talked about it. And then you begin to look at what does it look like to heal if I need to, or become more holistically healthy and
Right.
integrated outside of that context. And that could be a big transition. And in some cases, it could be really helpful because maybe, hey, this really wasn't discussed here, but wait a second, there's all this other stuff. And wow, these are really effective. Maybe breath
Right.
work is more normalized. And not that it's not happening, but at least my conversation with John and some other guys is like, hey, I think there was some of it that was good and some of it that just wasn't, it was behind, so to speak, in that military setting.
Well, and I mean, and rightfully so. Not that it's good, but rightfully so, and that it's, again, not a negative statement, but it's inherently these are inherently bureaucratic organizations. I mean, they're departments of the government, so
right.
they're extremely large. There are steps that are involved with making budget and funding and the decisions around what we're going to invest that in possible. So, yeah, that in a lot of cases, the services and the military is even their leading edge stuff, in terms of like, service member cares, it probably lags a little bit just as a consequence of the administration that they have to go through to get it. So I don't think it's not necessarily a case of there's not some big, it's not conspiratorial around let's have treatment modalities that are 10 or 15 years behind the times. I think it's just a matter of probably practitioners knowing what
Yeah.
right looks like, and it just takes a while to get through the bureaucratic process. And so
Yeah.
I think in a lot of cases, then, and purely anecdotally, but you probably have folks that are getting whatever folks who've either taken the step to get whatever kinds of mental health treatment is available while they're in the service. And it may be 10 or 15 years, behind the times in some cases. And then they exit the service, and then they might have I mean, it's essentially like the US Postal Service versus Amazon, right? You go from a public sector to a private sector model, and you see
Mm,
kind of the differences and, the pluses and
yeah.
minuses of both. And so I think people
Sure.
are dealing with that. And then also what's interesting, it kind of going back to the last point too, it's like a lot of people who are separating from the service, they're seeing, here's this big new world out there, and and I'm basically a component in the machine. How do I take myself out of one, and how do I integrate into this new machine, which is much more fluid, much more dynamic. It's more diverse. It moves faster. But the thing that's kind of cool about it, particularly with folks who retire from the service, is that we're all kind of starting to reach that age in our lives. We're in our late 30s, early 40s, and to mid 40s in a lot of cases when we're retiring. And that's when folks are starting to take a look in the mirror, whether you served or not, and really starting to have some real reflections about your life. And it's like, well, what have I done and what's my impact? And so
Mm,
folks at that point, we've all been hyper focused on getting an education, getting the best job we can, finding our life partners that we're going to, that it's going to make a good team that lasts. And then on top of that, you have your just life aspirations and those lifetime goals that are outside of anything professional, and you kind of arrive at that point in your life. So it's really an exciting and scary time then for people who are exiting from the military, because physiologically they're starting to have those reflections as a person in their
mm,
late 30s to mid 40s about, it's like, well, what's my legacy? What am I really doing here? And have I been prioritizing the right things? Or maybe I did prioritize the right things, but now my priorities are changing as I'm kind of entering into middle age. And what does the second half look like? Right. And then on top of
yeah.
that, you're doing it in a completely new system. So a lot of stuff going on for people who separate, in terms of where they're at in their life and their age, and then also just being in a completely new operating environment, for lack of better terms, right?
Yeah. Can you speak more about that, even for your experience? Something that kind of piqued my interest is that, hey, we're looking in the mirror, so to speak, and reflecting on, kind of life's purpose, life work. What am I doing? What do I
Mm-hmm.
really care about? And, and from your journey coming out, military, leaving, you did contract work too, kind of more private. It's kind of a blending of the two, private public sector, but still kind of not your own thing, and
Mm-hmm.
contract work, and then coming out now and now doing your own thing. And it's been not even, not even a year, but what does that look like for you, of not only on the business side, but more like, I'm more intrigued by what's it looking like in the internal side of Tyler, of, as he's reflecting on his life and looking at what I really want to care about, what's my legacy, purpose now in my, if I'm in my 40s, you know, I have my life partner I've chosen well there, and to be a
Mm-hmm.
good team, which, by the way, is always a good thing to choose
Right.
wisely. So that's good. That
Yeah,
makes things a
one
lot
less
easier.
stressor. It becomes a
Yes.
benefit instead of a hindrance in your
Yes.
operations. So you want your partner to be beneficial to you in
Totally.
your life operations, and likewise,
Yeah.
you want to be an
Yeah.
effective stakeholder for them and theirs as well. I mean,
Yeah. It's a
not
team.
not to over business,
True.
my marriage, but I mean, in a sense, it is. I mean, we're a
Yeah.
corporation, and we have to be able to
Yeah.
communicate effectively and add value where we can.
Yeah. And work well together in team and support all those things, right? You have to, because otherwise it becomes a significant stressor, right?
Right.
So that could be, if you have a good team, it becomes a stress reliever. And of course, even with a good team, you're going to have stressed moments. There's going to be conflict, but hey, if you navigate it well, it actually increases intimacy, increases vulnerability and connection,
Mm-hmm.
right? All those things, right? I
Mm-hmm.
mean, because every couple has conflict. Anyway, that's
Right.
a side note. But what is, as far as Tyler having, looking in the mirror now and reflecting on his life and the work that you're doing now, as you look at kind of integration between psychological, your business, social, physical, spiritual, what is that looking like now in this transition from kind of coming out of the 20 years and retiring and now stepping into this, like the kind of the under the hood, so to speak, what's going on for Tyler as he's venturing out and doing this thing?
So I look a lot to Maslow's hierarchy. I think that he was correct in how he formed it. So I apply it, to my own life as well as my business, and I consider it when I'm consulting clients as well. So, you have to, and it's one of those things. It's not like you arrive at the next stage, whether you go from basic physiological needs to, safety and security, as, love and relationships, esteem, and then eventually you're self-actualized. I think that there's work that continues to go into all of it. It's just some
Mm,
of your priorities change over time, where it's like early on, you're at the bottom of that pyramid. It's like, having enough money so you have some flexibility to have some time to focus on things that are maybe just for you, like lifetime goals and achievements, as opposed to professional accolades and career success and those types of things. So I would say that of course physically I'm far past my prime now, but I think in terms of my emotions and my mind, I'm in the best place that I've ever been. And
Yeah.
you know, again, when you're starting a new business or being an entrepreneur or solopreneur or vetrepreneur or whatever we're calling it, you know, there is some uncertainty that comes along with that. And so if you look back to like the lower levels of Maslow's hierarchy, it's like, well, there's probably some increased sense of insecurity that comes along with
Mm,
that. Cause, you know, is anyone going to want what I'm selling? Is the business going to flop? You know, am I going to be back in the job market in 2 years because I didn't hit revenue numbers well enough, or those types of things? But then at the same time, you know, you have that other dynamic where you're becoming more evolved as a person, to where, you know, hopefully, you know, you're knocking on the door of self-actualization, which, you know, I'm certainly not self-actualized yet, but I think that I have moments where I dance on that border and it feels really good. And I think that
mm,
where I got better at that and went from just kind of thriving at the bottom of the pyramid animalistically to where I consider myself to be a more thoughtful, empathetic,
mm,
evolved person, as I started to bring some other outside influences into my life and
mm,
prioritize some things that weren't specifically occupationally based or career
mm,
aspiration based. And so really in my mid 30s, I made a concerted effort to adopt some hobbies, where I had about a 10-year stretch where I was climbing the ladder, both in the military on the National Guard and Reserve side, promoting all of that good stuff. People liked me, good evaluations, whatever. And then also on the career side, where I rapidly promoted through the ranks within, you know, a large global firm, and was on track and was on known and all of those things. But, you know, I came to a realization. I won't say it wasn't like one key moment, but it was within a pretty short period of time. It's like, there's all of this stuff that I haven't done because I've been chasing this other stuff. And now I have
mm,
this stuff. So it's like, what do I want to do next? Do I just want to stack more of the same stuff on top as like artificial objectives? Or do I want to start incorporating some of my natural, you know, true objectives or things that I want to achieve in my life? And so I decided that I needed to start operationalizing some of these other goals and aspirations that I had.
mm,
And it wasn't all just about work. So, you know, started climbing mountains, started gardening, started getting
mm.
into some hobbies, you know, jumped into social media in my 40s. And so been navigating and, you know, figuring LinkedIn out. So there's just all these other things that aren't a direct benefit to my professional career track, but
Mm,
they're things that have really, you know, over the last 9, 10 years now, I would say, is where I really started making a concerted effort to hobby effectively. It's
yeah.
rounded me out so much as a person. It's allowed me to meet other types of people, and so that's part of that integration as well. And, you know, Travis, we were talking about it before. It's like you're making that shift in life where you're going from the corporation to the cooperation, and you're starting to
Mm,
just co-op with other people, like-minded people, or people from your demographic who maybe have different opinions and views on things. And it's a chance to have discussions and kind of put a little bit more onto your hard drive to consider, and
yeah.
you know, take some of those lessons and apply them in your own life where they're beneficial.
Yeah. And you mentioned hobbies of like, gardening and climbing. I guess from that, kind of what's happening in the internal as I'm just going to follow this train of thought, like as you're gardening, like, what does that do for you? Like what's happening for
Man.
as a hobby, but what is that? I'm assuming it's a form of practice, right? So I'm just like wondering, what is that as you garden, like what's actually happening for Tyler inside, psychologically, physically, emotionally, spiritually? Like, what's that? I guess what is going on?
So I like to refer to, well, gardening especially, as I refer to it regularly, as active meditation. And I'm probably certainly not the first person to do that. And since I started gardening and occasionally even post stuff about the gardening on the socials, which, you know, at first, if someone's like looking at me and they look at my, you know, work history and profile, it's like, what is this guy doing? Right. And, you know,
Hmm.
kind of taking on some of the, you know, the hippy dippy stuff or woo woo stuff or whatever. But it's like, I think that's all about expansion of your mind and looking into some of these
Hmm.
other things. So specifically when I garden, I feel like it's a good extension of a lot of what I applied in business and in the military, where it's you're planning long life cycle iterative projects with gardens.
Mm,
And so, I someone quoted, and I don't remember who, but they essentially said that if you want to learn how to run a business effectively, plant a garden,
mm,
because you're essentially manning a long-term life cycle. And even if you're going to the store and buying the starter plants and planting the few seeds that you would plant in a growing season, you still have to see that through and care for it. You have to implement your program effectively, meaning you plant your stuff at the right time, you plant it correctly, and then you have your operations where you're caring for that and making sure your garden's weeded and all of these other things, all the way to the point of harvest, and then to where you're preserving food and cooking food. And then, like, we even took on where we started composting. And so
yeah.
we prepare in the fall where we gather all of our leaves, and then in the spring we're composting again. So it really turns into an iterative life cycle. And I would say for me internally, well, one, I think there's something very primal about getting your hands in dirt and caring for a plant, in much in the same way that, sitting around a campfire just speaks to
Mm,
people wherever they are, whatever language they speak, anywhere in the world. So I think that gardening is kind of one of those things that's in our DNA and just speaks to us. And for me, it really got me back to where I was more appreciative of the
mm,
seasons. So I grew up on a family farm, so we were very much tied to the seasons and in how we did things when we could go places. If we could
yeah.
take a small vacation, it wasn't going to be during certain months and all of that type of stuff.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
and so I kind of got some of that seasonality back in my life. And I feel like me being tied to the seasons through my garden, it's allowed me to kind of have these micro reboots. Like, so in the springtime, we get things ready, we get the plants, and then you have a chance to look back and have all the joy of plants popping out of the ground, and you're watering them, you're taking care of them, you're getting to harvest. And so you have all these different phase lines,
Mm,
and milestones that you're meeting. And with each one, it's like you're getting a sense of accomplishment.
mm,
So as opposed to, I'm just working, I come home, I make a meal, maybe I hit the gym and watch a little bit of Netflix, and then we go to bed, and then we do it all over again. For me, I felt like I was never resetting. Like, I was always leaving the
mm,
computer on because I was always doing the same things, and I
mm,
was never getting the updates. Whereas when I started to add things like growing my own food, having the joy of what that feels like, having a planning process that I wasn't doing for career progression or for money, but purely just because I wanted to
mm,
be, that really expanded my mind a lot to live seasonally. And since I started living seasonally again after kind of putting it on hold for about 20 years of my life, I found that my software was updated a little bit better. Like, I was getting
mm.
the regular updates because I was going through phases and I was doing the reboots and things like that, whereas that wasn't happening before. And it's just such a better place to be in, I think.
Yeah, and I'm wondering with that this, took this on, you gave a quick example of like, the rinse repeat of business, come home, have dinner, watch Netflix, go to bed.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, you know, I'm not gonna say, hey, if you're doing that, you're somehow wrong or whatever. But because I've had, days where, hey, after the kids go down, me and my wife will watch a show together, right? And I'm not hearing you say you can't do that, but I think what I'm intrigued by, where I want to go with this question is that I
Mm-hmm.
just want to caveat this: if you do that thing, it's not a bad thing.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing you brought up, I think, is more of like you're finding a practice, and you said meditative practice of this process
Mm-hmm.
of gardening, of caring, of tending to, actually getting in the dirt and the psychological impact that's having, spiritual impact that's having of actually getting your hands dirty to
Mm-hmm.
having to tend and that it's really a holistic process, right?
Mm-hmm.
Gardening, really. And I'm curious, like, and you mentioned kind of meditative practice. I'm wondering what kind of impact have you noticed from this meditative practice of gardening? Like, what has been the kind of the internal impact you noticed? Maybe a couple things positive, maybe two, three things you've noticed, and maybe what's like two, three things that you've noticed, like socially or externally, that's changed because of this practice.
You're good at this. So,
Thank you. I'll take that compliment.
so I'll start with the latter part of it first, like as far
Mm,
as things that have changed. When I started gardening, I felt my social circles change.
mm,
And it wasn't intentionally. it was more a matter of I was trading in some things and not really people, but trading some activities in. And because I did that, it got me into other social circles, and it's neither good nor bad. It was just, again, seasons, and seasons change.
Mm,
So, I've been in a lot of organizations. So I've gone through team changes, whether I changed people on my team or I've got new departments or whether I went to new organizations. So I've been fortunate just by a matter of my trajectory that I've never been stuck, and stuck isn't the right word because I've had benefits from all these different organizations and people that I've worked with. But I also had the benefit of diversity because just like occupationally that changed all the time. And so I think the gardening was kind of an extension of that as well, where, I went from, because that all happened about the time that I was able to work from home, and I wanted to take advantage of that as well. So I'm
mm,
literally going from putting on suits. I'm working in a beautiful downtown office in a high rise, have a nice office. And then you go through the routine where you probably get up early in the morning so you can get your workout in the morning, right? Maybe it doesn't feel natural then. You do a whole day at the office. Then you and your colleagues, go out for a happy hour or something like that on a couple days a week or whatever. And you talk shop and strategy and all
mm,
this stuff. So, it was all productive stuff, but I started to get in that pattern where it's like all the conversations started to be kind of the same. And I wasn't really
mm.
learning anything more
Yeah.
outside of, a new inject into like our business life. Well, we got a new client, so we're talking about that, right? But it
Yeah.
was a lot of the same patterns and repeat. So I started working from home, planted the garden, dropped a bunch of weight, and I was even out of the office where I'd used to work for quite some time. And I went in one day and I was training for a marathon, so I was much sleeker. And people are like, "Oh, is Tyler sick? He lost a bunch of weight." It's like, no, I feel great. I'm
Mm,
getting ready to run a marathon. I'm getting ready to do all these other things. That's just a small example of kind of like changing your environment and
mm.
by adding some new things into it. And it's not to say that, I'm still friends with those people and we'll get together and we talk on the phone or whatever else. And, or, occasionally it's like, oh, hey, you want to come downtown? We're going to go across the street for a happy hour or whatever. It's like, yeah, sure, I'll come down as well. But I was adding and integrating other things into that. So maybe instead
Yeah.
of a couple of days a week, it became once a month. I would go see that group and I would get the download on that stuff and share
Mm,
what I had going on as well. But then, I was out in my garden and doing that. So then I'm starting to talk to people who garden and
yeah.
do that. And so you're just integrating things in because, yeah, to your point, some days it is you work all day and you're lucky if you get a workout in, you eat before 9 o'clock at night and watch a little bit of Netflix with the missus and then, go to bed. So
Yeah.
that happens, but you have to
Sure.
make a
Yeah.
concerted effort to kind of integrate some of those other things in and really
Yeah.
apply the effort to things just for the effort's sake and see what comes
Sure.
along with it without any real expectation of a direct benefit, at least immediately. But you'll
Yeah.
see that a lot of those benefits that you hadn't even anticipated start to enter into your life by trying new things.
Yeah. When I think of practices and habits, right? So, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
obviously, to make a quick example, like if my practice or habit is daily, come home after work, eat food, Netflix, go to bed, if that
Mm-hmm.
becomes your ritual of habit and practice, there's going to be an outcome of that. Like if that's kind of what you do, and so that there's going to be, like anything, a consequence, an outcome, a byproduct of that kind of life of that practice. And so,
Mm-hmm.
and often a lot of men I do work with initially is that, that kind of to some degree is their daily practice where there's not a lot of reflection, health, integration, growth, awareness of internal self psychologically, how they or reflection on how am I actually doing, because it is
Mm-hmm.
kind of like this rinse repeat. And so then over time you start to see kind of, the degradation or the byproduct of that kind of way of living, and often, increased stress. Maybe they're engaging in other behaviors that aren't so effective for them. Maybe, they're feeling low, maybe more anxious, more stressed out, right? And that
Right.
creates like this snowball effect of they're not really getting anywhere. But
And it
what we
makes it
do with their
harder to
practice.
start again too. Like even
Sure.
someone who's maybe like in his example, someone who's fitness minded and goes to the gym a few days a week, or they go out and get runs, but then they have a conference for a week and they weren't able to work out, or maybe they got injured and so they weren't able to work out. So again, that part of their routine was gone. And even if like you're a lifelong athlete or fitness focused, it's hard to start again. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's like, all right, this week I need to get back into the workout routine. I'm healed up or I'm back home or whatever that barrier was to not doing that habit for a week or two. And so you get back to that. It's easy to say, well, I'll do it Monday. Well, I got busy on
Yeah.
Monday, Tuesday.
Sure.
And then people look back, it's like, I haven't done anything in 5 years and I feel terrible and my life is a mess or whatever
Mm.
else. And it's like, I'm not in the
Yeah.
shape I want to be in. And it's like, it's so easy to lose those healthy habits
Sure.
and then
Yeah.
just let them fall to the wayside. So you really have to be deliberate about, obviously you have priorities to set. And again, looking to Maslow's hierarchy, there are things at the bottom of that pyramid that aren't always sexy, but you need to take care of those. But then
Yeah.
when you get into that middle area, you actually need to put some effort towards those things that have nothing to do with like immediate benefit, because they're how you get to self-actualization.
Yeah. Yeah. And, going back to what you said about the, finding this new habit for you, gardening, I think
Mm-hmm.
it's a great image, great analogies. And I'm still wondering, what is one positive shift you've noticed internally for Tyler since this gardening practice? What is something that he's noticed grow, change? Maybe something's decreased, maybe something's lessened in his life inside. I'm just kind of curious.
So again, I liken it to living seasonally or understand or getting back in touch with seasonality. I would say that the biggest internal benefit, which has become an external benefit for people that I work with, deal with, whether it's clients, whether it's family, whether it's friends, whatever, is I've become more patient. So, I mean,
Mm,
I'm indoctrinated in being a strategic thinker, right?
yeah.
But it brought back some of that patience with the seasonality. It's like, we have
Mm,
these things to do, but the cycle is the cycle, and I can only push it so hard. It's only going to
mm,
grow fast, and
yeah.
certain things are going to happen at certain times. And can I care for my garden? Can I water it correctly? Can I make sure I can do all these things to maximize the outcome, but the outcome is still within that plan, right?
Yeah.
And as opposed to, well, I can just throw resources or effort or will at
Mm,
it and I can accelerate it. Some things
sure.
just don't work that way. And
Yeah.
so I would say that human relationships are a lot like that as well, where there's only so much you can force someone, there's only so much you can pitch someone, there's only so much you can try and influence someone to the
Mm,
point where it maybe will make that relationship, for a lack of words, I mean, it'll make your relationship so that it's just not as productive as it can be, right?
mm,
Because you're trying to artificially force a construct onto the relationship, the personal relationship, the business relationship, the operational relationship, that isn't really possible. It's like,
yeah.
some people aren't going to be your friends. Some people aren't going to buy from you, or some people maybe will, but sometimes it might take 6 months. So
Yeah.
you have to consider that over a 6 month window. And this people aren't just going to bend for you the same way that you're just not going to bend for other people. And
Yeah.
so the seasonality and the tactical patience comes into play, where I know
Sure.
that there's certain things that I can't force. And I think that that's made me probably a better person to work for folks that have
Mm,
worked for me, and also a better partner to work with. And I say that socially as well as professionally.
yeah. Well, and I would assume too, because much like a garden, like you're right. You can't force it to grow, like you said, and there
You
has to
can you
be
can help it, you can help
you
facilitate it,
right.
but but
We still have to allow
there's a
time.
ceiling to those outcomes, and you have to
Totally.
accept that there's ceilings to outcomes. And
Right.
because especially when, like, you consider all the information that we're inundated with every day now, and you have hustle culture and grind culture, and there's someone who made their first million by 26, like Alex Hormozy, and you've got David Goggins, who can run 180 miles and all this other stuff. And then all of a sudden it's like, well, I'm in my 40s, and I haven't accumulated $1 million, at least not at one place in time, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe I've done it in totality, but it's not really the same thing. And I can run a decent marathon, but I can't go 180. So it's where you kind of start to appreciate more that your systems and your ecosystem is different than everybody else's. So do
Yeah.
what you can to maximize within your own, but also
Yeah.
understand that you're going to have limitations. And a lot of the examples that we see that influence us, and I think give people a lot of anxiety around they're not doing enough, like because I didn't make $1 million when I was
Right.
26. I can't run 180 miles. I can,
Right.
I can run a long ways, but not that far. Is that in some of those cases, these are extreme examples. And
Right.
in a lot of those extreme cases that we then set as our marker, they don't really apply when you're more integrated or a more holistic person, because a lot of those
Right.
people who are reaching those pinnacles within those areas that becomes then the marker that society has to try and meet, they're doing that at the expense of other things in most cases.
And I think that's what most people don't realize. They
Right.
see a glimpse, they see a piece of someone's life, you know, and then that's the marker versus like, what's the whole person look like outside of that glimpse? And often
Right.
you'll see there's some sacrifices, maybe
Right.
plural, being made, and those can be great dependent upon the person. Now, and that's something else that came to mind as you're talking about gardening and this whole thing is a lot of just acceptance of, hey, I'm going to do what I can
Mm-hmm.
and in a way learn and grow, and also know that to some degree I have a lot, if not a ton, that I can't control.
Mm-hmm.
Especially with gardening, right? You there's a lot you can control, but there's also, you know, the weather could turn and have a really bad, it could get too hot and I could burn things. It get too cold and freeze. I mean, so there's some degree we have to accept that and move with the changing of the seasons of like, hey, I have a lot of control, but there's a lot I don't, and I have to practice acceptance of. If you think of your garden, like, well, I want this to grow by the end of the week and I'm going to try and push it. Well, I'm going to keep watering, right? Well, that's going to kill the plant, right? Or the or the harvest. So to some degree, there's a lot of letting go, I think, in gardening,
Mm-hmm.
of like allowing it to take its, to its own time in a way that I have a component. And I think what a great practice to practice patience versus being on like this device, social media, because going from everything's instant, I want it now, or I want to have that million, or I want to run 180. It's like, it's a lot of letting go in gardening, I would say too. A lot
Right.
of just, hey, I'm slow. You have to slow down, right? It forces you to slow down, to pay attention to the details.
Right.
It forces you to kind of breathe and take the moment in, to understand weather patterns. And that takes time. It's not fast, like it's not quick by any stretch of the imagination. And it could be dependent upon what you are doing, very labor intensive,
Mm-hmm.
very, you don't really see the results right
Right.
away.
Right.
And even then in the harvest, your results may be amazing. It may be kind of, oh man, what happened,
Well, and
and
some
then you
of
go
those
back
are
in there.
under the ground, so you can't
Hmm.
even tell until you're literally right there.
Right.
So there are some things like I can see how well my tomatoes are doing, and I can see
Hmm.
how well my peas are doing. You have no idea how well your carrots are doing until the last moment.
I know.
So there's a level of anxiety that can come
Totally.
along with that, and
Yeah.
uncertainty that's like, oh, these I have these beautiful potato plants and they look great. There's two potatoes under each one. So
Yeah.
it's like,
Yeah.
well, what am I doing
Yeah.
here? And I just spent all this effort on it, but that's part
Well,
of it.
and one quick question, since you mentioned it, hey, when you get with anxiety, it's I think a common thing we deal with in society today, and a lot of people I
Mhm.
think are overly stressed and anxious. What's one simple practice that you do when you notice anxiety rise in you? What's kind of a simple thing you engage
Well,
with?
I mean, I follow some of the same general practices that are. I'm not breaking any news here with some
Sure.
of these methods, but it's like when you get the email from somebody and you already kind of have some preconceived notions about the situation where you're probably already pissed about something, or you're in a debate or a point of disagreement. And so I found this with myself where, I start when I start loud typing, I know that I just need to take a step back. In some cases, and everyone's typed the pissed email. If you find yourself typing the pissed email and
Yeah.
even saying the words as you type it and using a voice to do it, it's probably a good idea to take a step back and let it sit in a draft, reconsider it. And so, because
Mm.
those are the situations where, again, we might get a little bit animalistic then, and we kind of get into like a fight or flight type of situation where we either shut down on who we're working with or we want to beat them, right, at
Mm,
whatever the game happens to be. And sometimes that ends up being destructive. And so some of that's on impulse. Whereas, again, let's think about it seasonally. Maybe it's Tuesday. Maybe we're talking Tuesday. So it's maybe instead of this long, mad email I just wrote, it's like, okay, I think we have some, let's talk more about this when we meet on Thursday, right? So
mm,
that might be just a way to kind of let the temperature come down a little bit and then
yeah.
have a productive discussion about it. So, I do things like that where I'll take a step back from the situation just to kind of evaluate myself, and then kind of more as normal practice outside of like specific situations. Again, like the gardening, I do other
Mm,
things that I'm not so much of like a pure meditation guy. I've tried it. I haven't figured it out in a replicable way before for myself yet, but I'm working on that.
yeah.
But active meditation is a big one for me. So like the gardening
Mm,
is big, but
yeah.
I posted on social media about it recently. I started weaving a gill net for no other reason than just
Yeah.
because it's
Yeah.
like it's something that you can do that kind of makes use of your hands. And I like those tactile things too, because, you know, I, I take a look back at my life, and I was telling my wife, it's like, for the last 10 or 15 years, I've been doing corporate stuff and I haven't really been in the field quite as much. I've been more on the leadership end. It's like, if there was an EMP tomorrow and all the computers were gone and the electricity was gone, or it's like I didn't even exist. I mean, it's all
Mm.
spreadsheets and memos, and yes, it was like coordinating people and moving things around in real time, but those things, it's like they don't exist now. Maybe they left an impact. So it's like nice having those tactile things. And I think
Yeah.
people need that. They need a sense
Yeah.
of accomplishment that's more than I helped the company hit revenue number and I got a bonus. So great, cool story. But
Yeah.
let
Yeah.
someone paint their garage, and then they're gonna sit in the lawn chair and drink a couple beers and just look at the garage they just painted. So I think people
Yeah.
need some of those tactile things as
Sure.
well. And if you don't have a big project, make a project. Even if
Yeah.
you're sitting and doing Netflix while you're doing it, have something in
Yeah.
your hands, work a little bit. And I think
Yeah.
it's a good outlet.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned two things, and then we'll start to wrap up. One, and I think you're right. It's like even the stuff I talk about is not necessarily, to some degree, not nothing new, but it's more about. And we were talking about this offline, is having more men talking about practices like this, normalizing it, because I think a lot
Mm-hmm.
of men, to some degree, have a lot of resistance to some of these kind of other possible woo woo practices, to
Mm-hmm.
quote you. And so even taking a step back, sometimes for a lot of guys, they may not do that practice of just, hey, just pause and take 20, take 2 days, take a day, and then come back when you're more collected and not so much in a maybe heightened state of anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
And what do you need to do to kind of bring yourself down? What are some practices to kind of walk you down so you can be more clear-minded and really
And
effective?
not cause damage in a moment on an
Right.
impulse.
Not create more suffering, right?
Right.
Unneeded suffering. Because
Right.
that's when we make a mistake, is it's stressful, and then we react, and then our reactions can cause a whole bunch of damage
Well,
to
we
ourselves, to those
project we
around us.
project our feelings in that moment onto other
Right.
people, and then it snowballs.
Totally.
As opposed to, it's like someone's got to break that season, and there is a season for conflict, right, and
Yeah.
discourse,
Sure.
but let it pass then too, and move
Yeah.
on into the next season and grow again.
Yeah. There is such thing as effective conflict, right? Absolutely. Effective conflict or effective fighting, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think of the Gottmans recently released a book. They're researchers in couples therapy, like 50 years of research, the most research. They're like the pinnacle of researchers.
Mm-hmm.
But they just released a book called Fight Right. It's all about, hey, you're gonna fight, we'll do it right. Like, how do you do it well within like an intimate relationship, and how do you use that as a means to increase connection, intimacy? So there is such a thing as healthy conflict. And so taking a step back, I think, is sometimes one of the best things you could do in a moment. And that, even though it's simple in practice, it's not like complicated, the effect can be massively positive and keep you from creating unneeded suffering or pain, or making things worse for yourself or those around you. And then I love what you said too, and I want to just reiterate that I think yes, active meditative practices or active mindfulness practices with your hands, absolutely. I think there's something as like walking meditations. Like, yes, movement for some people is very effective because it helps engage that kind of the whole body too, which
Mm-hmm.
to some degree is even easier because you're not just I think people think of meditation or mindfulness. You just got to sit down with your legs crossed and, hands like this and hum and just listen to a bowl and,
Right.
and be silent. Right now, that might be your cup of tea and that might be very helpful for you. But for a lot of people, that is not helpful for them. And they need,
Right.
in fact, that for some people can cause more anxiety because it's too much for them. It's like, wait, what? And so that's a type. But other types, and I think that's why I commented on your net. I'm like, hey, I could see how that in and of itself can be very meditative, very calming because it's very intentional. You have to
Hmm.
be mindful. You
Right.
have to slow down and breathe. And my guess is a lot of moments of frustration and what you do with that frustration, because you could be like, well, F this net and toss it and throw it.
Right.
And I'm sure there was moments that you're like, why am I doing this? And then you come back and it's kind of teaching you to like deal with that pressure and tension, even
Hmm.
guarding too, of like noticing the emotional rise of frustration or impatience and coming down and riding that wave. And I think what a great way to practice actively. So I think those are amazing skills that you found that are highly beneficial for you.
Well, the other thing too is that, again, we kind of, and again, me saying it's purely anecdotally, you understand it better than I do, but it's only been in like the last, what, 40 years, 30, 40 years that we've truly been in like the information and digital age.
Mm-hmm.
Prior to that, it was what, tens of thousands of years that we were kind of doing the same stuff. We were going out and fishing. We were going out and hunting. We were making a fire. So a lot of this stuff is still on our hard drive. And
Yeah.
a lot of it, it's like, it's not that we've intentionally ignored it, but I think we underappreciate how much it's part of our makeup. And those things
Yeah.
need those outlets as well. Whereas I wear a suit, I go into work, or I work from home and I do stuff with emails and I make some calls and I coordinate. So someone somewhere is doing something because of my input, but I'm not doing the thing. And maybe the thing has some permanence, or maybe it's just a service and it's a temporary to where it's gone. But how are we then addressing those tactile things where we're actually creating something,
Sure.
not because not because the work we're doing, like as a service or
Mm-hmm.
digitally, isn't important, but we need to have some of these other things. So I think
Yeah.
people go fishing, people go camping, people
Yeah.
do these other things, people go to the
Yeah.
gym. It's like you need to have some of those things that are really tactile because it's a part
Sure.
of who you are. And I think that if we get removed from it, where we're just looking at a screen, it's like you're in the matrix, and are you really existing
Sh-
anymore?
Yeah. And it is about that kind of, it's about integration and healthy, like holistic practices. And this last weekend, I did backyard camping with my boys,
Mm-hmm.
had a fire. I
Mm-hmm.
love sitting. One of my favorite things is sitting in front of a fire. Like just silence for hours. Like I love it. Like you mentioned, I'm like, it's one of my favorite. I could do it every day. And so,
It's mesmerizing. It speaks to people no matter where they are,
totally.
socioeconomic class.
Oh
It
yeah.
doesn't matter. I mean,
It
even
doesn't
to the
matter.
extent that you ever want to get a bump on a social media post, put a 5 second clip of a campfire on that bad boy, or put a picture of a
Yeah.
campfire. There are some things that just undeniably speak to people. So
Oh yeah.
it's important for us, those things that truly just inherently speak to
Yeah.
us. We should
Yeah.
indulge those interests when we
Yeah.
can.
And my middle son, I think of him, and we'll kind of wrap up. He loves that. Like he is. It's like, yeah, he just my oldest son too. He's also intrigued. But when I watch my middle son, my second son, Eli, he's so into it, and he'll just sit there and just kind of, you see him kind of engaging with it, and I'm watching his face and his body language and the calmness that comes over him, and kind of like the effect it has, even on his like nerve. If I think of his nervous system, like he's 4.5. He's a mover. He wants to, and not that he sits there for an hour because he wants to move. But
Well,
when he's
he
engaged,
wants to be four still, and he's got to
yeah,
integrate some other. He's got to
yeah,
integrate the other things that go along with his fourness.
totally. And his foreignness too also teaches me something about being out and moving as well. Like
Right.
there's something about this natural drive to want to move, and that can in a way is part of our culture now. If we're hyper behind a computer, we're not moving enough. Anyway, that's a whole other podcast. But
Mm-hmm.
watching him is like this thing about that fire. The nature is a calming effect and kind of meditative, and it slows things down And there's this interaction between the fire, and it is mesmerized because he is mesmerized by it. You know, he's
Mm-hmm.
just sitting there, just kind of watching it and engaging with it, and it is very calming. And so it's cool to watch the impact on him, even at 4.5, and
Mm.
just watching how he's impacted by it, and just not, not trying to shape or move it, but just observe him. Even for
Right.
me, is like a whole other practice of observing another being, and so that's a whole other. We could probably have a whole podcast on that, which we probably
It'll be
should. But
interesting to see what he does when he grows up, because it seems like he's probably pretty in tune with some
yeah,
of that stuff we've been talking about. So you never know, if you'd
yeah,
be surprised to see him out, and maybe he'll be in the woods someday doing
I
something
think
professionally with that.
Yeah, I think that's me and my wife say that. I think that's where our eldest is more math.
Mm-hmm.
He's like, deconstructing, you know, cars. I mean, he's it's all like engineer,
Mm-hmm.
math, numbers, that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
That's where he's at, his brain. So different wiring. Where I find like my middle one is more like that physical nature, just like getting in it, like he's out, every time it rains, he's hunting for worms and collecting them and putting them in our composter or in our
Seems like
garden.
he has a good sense for seasonality.
He does. So, I'm trying to cultivate that, and my older son, and what intrigues him and piques him. And then, my daughter, she's just a hellion right now, so I don't know yet, but she's the wildest one of the bunch, which is funny. My youngest. Anyway, but as we wrap up, two things. One, random, I know, but this is a new phase with being the Integrated Man Project right now, and
Mhm.
something that I find very beneficial in my life is music. So with that said, what's something you're currently listening to? What are you listening to on repeat, or what's kind of got your interest in music?
So it was probably about 6 months ago, maybe a little bit more, when the Oliver Anthony kind of swept the nation,
Okay.
the North of Richmond song, right? So, like everyone else, I listened to that, on repeat for a couple of days, but it got me onto a YouTube channel. It's called Radio West Virginia.
Okay.
And so there are a lot of artists kind of from that Virginia, West Virginia, kind of northern Appalachian influence. And so I find, to where I've watched it enough on YouTube now, where when I listen and work, kind of that Appalachian mountain plus probably a hint of bluegrass in there as well. And
Mm,
it just really works for me, like when I'm
mm,
working, because it kind of flows like a breeze a little bit, so it doesn't take
mm.
my mind off the work, but it also gives me something. And
Nice.
I mean, Oliver Anthony, wonderful song, very, very, it came from the soul a bit, and
Mm,
I'm glad that it blew up. But now that I like listen to Radio West Virginia, it's like, man, there's a lot of good stuff on here. Again, like anything else, you've got some indie artists that maybe it's a little bit rough, but that you kind of take it with a grain of salt. But it's like, man, there's some really, really interesting people talking about important things out here through song. And
mm.
it's like, artful
Yeah.
commentaries on the state of society, what
Yeah.
we've gained, what we've lost, maybe some of the
Mm,
ills of convenience, because I think we've been talking about that kind of quite a bit. There's like the benefits of modernization and the convenience that comes along with that, but there's kind of the ills of that too, that we always
sure.
have to be on, we always have to be crushing it, we always have to be going,
Mm,
we have to be as good as business at her as Harmozy is, we have to be as good at running as David Goggins, and there's all these other
yeah.
people at these pinnacles, and then we start driving ourselves nuts. So in a sense, it's great that we're interconnected digitally, so we can see all of these influences, and it helps the human condition to where we can extend and push what's possible as human beings. But at the same
Mm-hmm.
time, is a lot of time I feel like I'm just an average dude out here trying to survive my day. So for me, it's
Yeah.
important to kind of take the good elements of this digital Pandora's box for the influence and the inspiration, but then also understanding that, I can't go out and train 8 hours a day. So I'm not going to be David Goggins. I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do the other thing, but I can take some of those elements and integrate them into my own
Yeah.
life. So
Yeah. No, well said. Totally well said. Absolutely right. I'm gonna check out Radio West Virginia. I'll have to
yeah.
check it out. I'm intrigued. And I like asking too, personally, because I also want to expand what I'm listening to. So
What
it's
do you
also kind of
like
a little
right now?
selfish. Oh, right now I have been listening to, hold on. Well, there's been a lot of the Frozen soundtrack. And
Love it. Love it.
so that's been on constant because my daughter's like
Right.
into it, or the Bluey album. Those are because my kids like Bluey. So it's more of like that. This is just by what they're in their car. This is what we're listening to lately. So Aladdin soundtrack. So the, um, so it's been the Aladdin soundtrack. If anything, has brought me back to my childhood and growing up with those Disney movies and like thinking through. So it was more of like, oh yeah, I remember this when I first saw this movie. And but outside of what my kids are listening to, I think what I've been listening to. Hold on, I have to go. It's like if I'm looking on Spotify, it's like it's all the kids stuff. It's
Hmm.
so it's like scroll through. What did I actually choose? What was last
Yeah.
night? And I would say something that, and I said this more recently. Something I'm listening to on vinyl is it's a couple of things I've been going back and forth. Is either the Phoenix. It's a French band, kind of indie rock band called Phoenix.
Interesting.
Um, and then their latest album, and then the other one I've been going back and forth with, and just for the past few months I've been kind of coming back to it, was the Postal Service's record, because they had the 20-year anniversary tour of releasing that record. So I got to see them with my wife and some friends at the Hollywood Bowl, and they
Nice.
and so I bought the repressed vinyl of that, and the kids will dance to it, and so yeah, it's fun. I think we love music in this house. We'll do a lot of dance parties and stuff, and they like the vinyl, and they like that because over the digital music. So it's fun to see kids what their natural
So
affinity is.
is that your preference? So are you the vinyl guy in the house and everyone else is co-opted into that then?
Yeah, so it's more of a recent hobby, and I mean past few years, but the kids actually, I remember my oldest son, he used to kind of just put his head by it, when he was like 2 and he was really into it. So they'll ask more for it. And I'm like, "Oh,
Hmm.
let's play it on here on the digital." And they're like, "No, no, no." And they go over there, and the problem is I don't have every record. So I'm like, "Well, I don't have it on this, so we have to do digital." So they'll get
Right.
into it, but their natural draw is like that analog stuff. It's interesting. And they'll kind of get close to it and feel it,
Well,
and
it seems like for you too, because you like me are in the service industry, right? So a lot of what
mhm.
you do is it's tangible in its results,
Yeah,
but it's very intangible in by nature. So it
yeah.
almost feels like, we've been talking about this and it seems like your interest in vinyl is adding the tactile part into your love for music.
Totally. Yeah, and I play guitar and I do all that kind of
Right.
stuff too, and so it's fun, and I have instruments, so I love the tactile. So I think you're right. I think the thing
It's the
about
whole
that,
experience. You go to the store, you think about the record you want to buy, you can pick it
yeah,
up, then you can listen to it. And you're immersing yourself into the physical aspects of that passion, right?
yeah, and it forces you to slow down, right? And
Hmm.
so I think the balance of slowing down as well as the modern day stuff, I think is kind of this theme of how do we balance the modern day amenities and positive things that's enabled to engage, like even us having a conversation, it's like it enables us to do this easily. And also,
Right.
how do we still use kind of the stillness of slowing down and tactile, because we need both, and kind of integrating both. So with that said, where can we find you?
Wielding that double-edged sword effectively, man. You summed
Totally.
it up so perfectly. Take the
Yeah.
best of both parts of it and
We need both.
don't get cut in the process.
Yeah, you need both because both have huge positives. But I think
Hmm.
to the extreme, both can also, they can be, you can get stuck. And so, with that said, hey, if someone wants to find Tyler and wants to work with Tyler, who's listening to this, where can we find you? What's the best
Well,
way?
thank you for asking. So my company is Winsley. We focus on high performance executive coaching. Plus, I do consultancy work, and as an extension of it, I do some strategy work and even a little bit of strategy work on LinkedIn, where I offer a course and I can do some refresh and some B2B advisory work. Leveraging LinkedIn as a CRM. So really kind of a full suite of traditional consulting services through a smaller shop. I tend to specialize more with smaller founders and mid-sized companies, and I'll leave the big Fortune 500s to McKinsey, and they can continue to chase that business. But to that end, the best place to find me is on LinkedIn. I'm pretty easy to find. So Winsley is my company. I'm Tyler Schmoker, and if you're interested in working with me or hearing more, I'd love to hear from you. We can set up a discovery call and see if we might be a fit.
Yeah. Well, Tyler, thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure having you on. and great conversation. So thank you
Yeah,
so much.
absolutely. Absolutely. Thank
Blessings
you
to all
so
the
much,
work you do,
Travis.
man. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, man.
See ya.